Well, hi, Team Healthy. You know that I'm constantly looking on these podcasts to find some guests that can speak with us about some very interesting topics and topics that I would consider to be relevant. You know that so many families have this strong, large, and in charge leader to them. And we have a guest here today, Meredith Miller, who's going to talk with us about how there actually can be a cult like feeling that narcissistic families can generate. And so we're going to talk to her about that. So, first, Meredith Miller, I am so pleased to have you here with us, and you live not too far away from where I am. But Meredith, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, well, we were talking about I had spent my entire career in the Dallas Fort Worth area, and you were on the I was on the northern end, you're on the southern end of all of that, and so literally you're not that far away, so just right up the road from me. Um, Talk to us about some of the work that you do and how you got into this work. Give us a sense of backdrop with respect to that.
I do holistic coaching work with people. So I was working in narcissistic abuse recovery for a while. Now I'm kind of bridging into more advanced coaching with people who are transmuting their trauma into a new sense of purpose. I believe that our traumas are like our immersion training for the purpose that we're here to live. But so for many years, I was doing YouTube videos and podcasts and helping people recover after narcissistic abuse in relationships or the family system. And then I kind of started transitioning in the recent years and focusing more on the trauma to purpose journey.
And that's it's so essential because and I know that there are some individuals that it's like once they become identified as a victim of trauma, then they just kind of stay stuck.
Yes.
And I'm hearing you say, well, sure enough, it can leave scars, but we can move forward and move out of it. So kudos to you for all of that. Way to go. So um, now we're talking today about how some family systems can have some cult-like tendencies. How did you get to the point where you began putting those two entities together like that?
So I had some clients who were actually coming out of actual cults, some like landmark and other spiritual cults, and they would talk to me about the dynamics. And I would realize it's the same exact patterns and dynamics that happen in the family system. And usually there are also people who came from a family system like that because they were neurologically programmed to recognize that as connection, love, and home. And so then I started looking at these side by side and realizing it's basically the same dynamics.
Yeah. Now, if you can help us out, when you say the same dynamic, obviously, when you talk about a cult, we're talking about somebody who's the large and in charge leader. Now, one of the things that I watch for, and you tell me if I'm on track with this, is typically when you're that kind of person who sets that dynamic up, it's not just narcissism. But typically, it tends to go beyond that with malignant narcissism or sociopathy, psychopathic tendencies. But what's your experience or what's your take on that?
I would say for sure too. Usually, like within a system, like a family system, there's like the head psychopath or narcissist, and then there's maybe, under that ranking, there's other shades of
Colonels and
narcissist.
lieutenants along the way.
Exactly. So maybe they're not as sharp, they're not as cunning, they're not as crafty with the way that they're leading. So everybody is serving that one on top, who's maybe the matriarch or the patriarch of that system. And then, of course, that system is also formed by enablers. And unfortunately, it's the enablers who maintain that system because the abuser would be powerless without all the minions. And so people can end up being enablers or what we call flying monkeys, either consciously or unconsciously. So they could actively be doing the bidding of the head narcissist or the others on top, or they're passively doing that bidding. But everybody becomes an accomplice to the crime until a person wakes up and steps out of that system. Because the only way to survive when you're in that system is either to be an abuser or an enabler.
Wow. Okay. That's such a key thing to now see when we think about cults, we the word comes to mind recruitment. When we think about families, it's like, well, you showed up by virtue of the fact that you were born into it. But either way, I guess if it's a family system, it's not so much as you were recruited into it, but you were just brainwashed from very early years then.
Yeah, so that's the psychological isolation. So sometimes there's physical isolation where, they tell you have to stay home, you can't go outside, you can't see your family and friend, your extended family and friends in this case, or you can't work, like you have to stay here. That happens in some cases, but predominantly it's psychological isolation where the person will leave the house multiple times a day, or maybe when they grow up and they no longer live with the family, they're living on their own, but they're still deeply embedded because that main abuser is going to set and control the entire narrative of the family system. So everybody has to be completely subscribed. Any person or any information that contradicts that narrative is smeared and discarded so that they maintain that everybody is completely subscribed to this narrative. And if you question that, you get ostracized, you get targeted for that. And so that's how they control the perception of reality. That's how they control the belief that everybody has. And that's why everybody ends up subscribing because you're not permitted to have a different perception of reality.
One of to me, it's beyond sad. It's tragic because of the evil element there. But we take our basic needs. You have a little child that wants to be loved, and they want to belong, of course. And so that authoritarian, narcissistic person can think, I can make this work for me. And so they take what's normal and turn it into something pathological. And where I'm going with that is it's like they engender that young person's dependence. It's like I'm just gonna empty you of anything that might be unique to you, and I'm gonna keep you with me. And as we do, then I'm gonna pronounce love on you or whatever. And it's pathetic. It's sinister, it's sadistic, but they're deliberately emptying that individual of their own distinction, saying, you must be a mini version of me.
Yeah, individuality is not tolerated in any cult system or the narcissistic family. And so, unfortunately, as you mentioned, like the child ends up sacrificing their own needs, their own perceptions of reality, their own feelings, because probably they're caretaking mom or dad's feelings. They're trying to subscribe to what's going on. They're complying in order to stay in connection because when you're a child, to not have that connection of your parents is life-threatening. You can't survive on your own. So that's the very beginning of the adaptations that we create to the abuse. And then we carry that into adulthood. So we become adults and we're completely unprepared for the world because we're trained to do the same dynamic with other people, which is why there's such a high repetition compulsion of people who grew up in these family systems and then get into more abusive relationships as adults.
I remember talking with one guy who was in his mid 30s, and he had very much what you're talking about right there. And he mentioned that when he was 18, he was homeschooled because no, you couldn't trust the regular schools out there. When he was 18, he decided he was going to go to the community college and get going so he could get some credit towards college. And he began for the first time, literally, to interact in any kind of meaningful way with the people out there. And he remembers looking back, I felt so inadequate. I wanted to get out there and be my own separate person, but it's like I was completely lost, and that's what I'm hearing you say. The indoctrination can be so strong that you have to have that authority person to keep you going. How does that work, and how does that happen over the course of years?
So you develop a case of learned helplessness, right, in that situation. So you become this powerless victim in life. And then your nervous system got programmed to recognize that treatment as connection, love, and home. So even let's say you woke up from that family system and you recognize, like that gentleman did, that he was unprepared, that something was really wrong, and you start unpacking that. Even when you have the conscious awareness of that, and even when you set boundaries with the family system, that neurological programming is still there. You can run as far as you want to the high Andes Mountains, like I did, and realize it's within the gates. It will follow you everywhere. You actually have to heal that. You have to reprogram your nervous system because it's like you still have that biological connection, even if you're adopted. Because even if you're adopted, your nervous system was programmed in that family system. So you separate, but your nervous system is still seeking that. It's connecting with that, and it overrides your conscious mind. So you can know everything about narcissistic abuse, but your own biology betrays you as you face this person or this other cult that you find in your life.
Meredith, I hope individuals understand the significance of what you're saying, because there are times I have one doctor friend in particular, and he loves to study the brain, and I mean, and he'll talk about how when your prefrontal cortex is trying to make sense of the messages that the amygdala is sending and all, over time, when you have these kinds of patterns there. Literally, neurologically, your brain is trained to have certain reactions. And there's some individuals who can speak into it much more eloquently than that. I mean, but literally it becomes neurological, like what you're saying. And so sometimes people can say naively, well, just get away from them. And like what you're saying, it's like, well, it's not quite that simple. It can be quite complex.
Right, because we're mammals at the core. That amygdala, the limbic system is mammalian. And so we seek connection more than we seek truth because our nervous system reads disconnection as life-threatening, as dangerous.
Oh,
So
go,
unfortunately,
can you say that again? Because
yeah.
that's too, I want to hear that again.
So this comes from Dr. Stephen Porges and the polyvagal theory. And so because we're mammals, because our limbic system is programmed to connect, right? Even think of our early human ancestors. If you were ostracized from the herd, you were going to die out there alone, right? So our nervous system has not evolved over 100,000 years, or however long it's been. So that's why it's going to seek connection before truth. Truth being, this is abuse. This is not okay for me, right? In that case, but your nervous system is going to seek the connection because it reads disconnection as potentially life-threatening.
Okay. And sometimes one of the things that we see is when you have that connection to that very strong authoritarian leader, cult-like inside a family, it's not all negative. Screaming and shouting and all of that, because there can be moments of tenderness that can cause that person to get into that connection. Now, obviously, there are plenty of other ingredients that show up, but it's not quite as harsh and mean as evil overtly as some other outsiders might presume. Talk about that dimension there.
Yeah, so there is the overt and the covert types of abuse, and the covert type is always disguised as for your good and because we care and because we want you to be healthy and safe and everything. So it can get very confusing. But also, every abuser, even the overt type, will use some acts of love bombing, which they call acts of perceived kindness in the Stockholm syndrome or the trauma bond, which I renamed the state of captivity because it's like a psychological, neurological, and spiritual state of captivity. It's internal. It's not based on being held in physical confinement. So that's the danger of getting programs like this is you start to interpret those signs of perceived kindness as genuine kindness, and that tricks your brain into the state of cognitive dissonance, into the state of denial, and then it actually causes it's like the dopamine circuit. So that intermittent reinforcement causes the person to work harder, to invest more, and to develop almost an obsession with compliance to get the intermittent reward.
Yeah. And how are outsiders depicted when you are inside that narcissistic or cult-like kind of a relationship?
Yeah, there's a very clear like us and then the outside in most cases, whether it's implicit or explicit. So maybe in the more overt cases, that's very defined verbally, it's talked about. In the covert cases, it's more indirect. It's like, oh, look at them, that family is such a mess, and that could even be they're talking about the extended family because the covert person is usually the head psychopath or head narcissist because they're the most insidious. They're the most cunning in the system. And so the covert type will point out the overt narcissist in the system, the aunt or whomever. Oh, did you see what so and so did? Because why that takes attention off of them and puts it
Mhm.
on the overt. And by comparison, you're thinking, well, this really isn't that bad.
Now, Meredith, I'm listening to you. It's like, man, I mean, you're so spot on with all of this. We often hear of narcissists themselves as being fear-based and shame-based, and that becomes the currency that they operate with. How is that conveyed then to the members inside their little system?
Yeah, so fear is the currency of control in any narcissistically abusive family system. So there's always the fear, whether it's very overt or it's covert. And again, that connects to the nervous system because when you're bombarded with fear, and fear again could be the fear of being disconnected, the fear of being ostracized, of not being accepted or wanted or in this family system. And so when the nervous system reads life threat, we go into states of collapse and freeze. It's like when a cat catches a mouse, the mouse fiends death. Like its body is shutting down vital systems. It's literally dying. But as humans, when we're stuck in these family systems and it feels inescapable, we have to adapt. We can't stay in that state of freeze, shutdown, and collapse for long term because literally we're dying. So the body adapts and we dissociate. So we check out. So people in these family systems, they maybe as children they develop a very active fantasy life, or they go to video games or TV, and then they get a little older in adolescence and they find drugs and alcohol or food and porn and gambling and sex and whatever the thing is, because when we can't escape, we look for escapisms. So people get stuck into these loops, and that's what keeps us stuck in these behavioral patterns and repetitions, even once we get out of the system or the relationship.
Um, Typically, and I know we can't just say there's a specific time, but what is it that prompts a person to say, "Hey, wait a minute, wait just a minute"? That's what my family put inside of me. I was brainwashed and all the rest, but I don't want to do this anymore. And I need to get out of this. How does a person get to the place where they can go to that space and then start doing something with it and about it?
Yeah, that awakening is unique to each individual, though the pattern that I see is that a person will go through the repetition in adulthood. They'll get into different relationships, whether it's an intimate partnership, friendships, at work, just people in their life. Eventually, one of those relationships wakes them up to the pattern of narcissistic abuse. And then eventually, at some point, they're usually able to start to see how that related to home. And they're able to start face that. The moment that the person breaks through that cognitive dissonance, I think it's like a negotiation between the person's soul and the divine, because there's really nothing that you as an outsider can do to wake them up. You might have a sibling or a friend or someone who's in an abusive relationship and you really want to wake them up. You want them to be healthy and happy and free, but there's nothing you can say or do to wake that person up until they're ready to see it, until they have that spontaneous breakthrough when suddenly they can't not see it.
Okay. And then once they start going into that space, what hindrances or barriers are they most likely to encounter when they begin either openly saying, "I'm not doing this anymore," or just quietly trying to move on down the road and hoping that you're not going to get in too much trouble? I mean, what begins happening then?
Yeah, so externally, usually what happens is the flying monkeys come. So as soon as you start separating or distancing yourself from the family system, they will send people after you to try to pull you back in. It's like that crab in the pot analogy where one crab starts to climb out and the others pull it back in. Everybody in cult systems will tell you that too. They start doing the phone chain. They've got everybody calling you and trying to keep you in that system. The danger is that that collective trance is so contagious that if you have contact with people from that system, even good people in that system who are unknowingly being enablers of the crime here, they will pull you back into that trance just by talking to them. Your brain is so easily going to go back into that trance. So it's kind of like if you want to quit alcohol, you have to cut off from alcohol so that you reduce your tolerance to it. And you start to recognize you were desensitized to the toxic effects of that, right? And then maybe you have a drink and then suddenly you notice, like, wow, that's so toxic on my body. I don't like the way it feels. It's the same way with contact. So you have to completely cut off contact if you want to reduce your tolerance to the abuse. And you want to start reprogramming your nervous system not to minimize that, not to accept that, not to lean into that. And then, of course, there's going to be tons of, oh, sorry, did you want to ask
Go
something?
ahead, go ahead.
Tons of guilt and shame about it, because everybody's going to tell you, how dare you? That's your family, even outsiders who don't understand. And this is going to be even worse for people who come from the covert kind of abusive families because nobody's going to have any empathy for you. They can't see it. They think the covert abuser is like the best thing ever, like Martha Stewart, like, Mother Mary. Like they see this like amazing person. They have no idea. And that's actually the most damaging part for the survivor is because you feel so alone. And you can even
Yeah.
go to a therapist and they often don't
How could
recognize.
you possibly want to run away from Mother Teresa?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
As you're talking, it strikes me that there are so many treatment modalities that could be good. We're talking about meditation or some of the other kinds of forms of treatment. So, as somebody that works with these individuals, and by the way, we're going to have contact information posted here too. What do you do in the beginning portions as far as helping them get back to where they're retraining their neurology, et cetera?
Yeah, so the first step is the person has the awareness of the problem. The second step is they start setting boundaries to distance themselves from it. Then a lot of people will confuse that. They'll think no contact means I'm healed now, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. No contact is just the boundary that protects the healing work that you're going to do. So in order
Great,
to
great designation.
Yeah, so in order to process all of that, it's like all of that trauma gets frozen in your nervous system. It's still in your body. It's just frozen, like it's in ice. And so it's a process of thawing that out little by little. Like it can't all come out at once. It's entirely too much, but it comes out layer by layer. And that involves allowing yourself to feel those feelings, the stuff that you had to stuff down in the moment to survive while you were in it, the stuff that was just too painful to deal. And so little by little, you start processing those feelings and you start to digest the experience. And then what you can do is you can extract the learning. And that's when you really get into the higher levels of healing because you can extract some learning from that where the trauma then converts into a new sense of purpose.
Mm. I can imagine that there's a great deal of confusion that can overcome that person because they can feel like, well, I know that I need something very different, but at the same time, I just feel like I'm leaving a whole way of thinking and being and living behind me, and it wasn't all that bad, was it? And there can be kind of that tug of war that goes on, even as they're knowing that they need to make the adjustment.
It's a long process and it often involves a lot of self-sabotage along the way. It's kind of like there's ups and downs. It's not really like a linear process of healing will go up and down in the process. People will self-sabotage. Why? Because their identity is still so ingrained in being the victim. As soon as you start shifting into a new state, like a state of empowerment where you're owning responsibility for your life, it's like everything, the whole system starts sounding the alarms and it wants to pull you back to this old identity. So you have to completely upgrade your identity. In fact, multiple times along the way, where you no longer define yourself. Because when you're in that system, everybody has a role. Like there's the golden child and the scapegoat roles, but it's more nuanced than that. So maybe the scapegoat is like it's the addict, it's the alcoholic, or it's the person who's got, mental health problems, or maybe the golden child is like the high achiever. And the moment they don't achieve in that way, or they want to change careers, then now they're no longer the golden child. So there's all these things wrapped up in your identity that you need to work on upgrading along the way.
I can only imagine the necessity of connecting with other individuals who have been through it as well. Because as you're talking, I'm thinking about the loneliness factor. You're pulling away from a system, and even sometimes as you're pulling away, there can be a rebellion that goes along with it. Maybe you've attached to some folks that aren't really good for you, but eventually you're getting to the place where you want to get around healthy individuals. But it can feel so just different. Man, I'm out here in a whole different country, and they're speaking a different language. And talk with us about how, I mean, do you have group situations or group recovery groups and things like that where there's all that support that to me would seem to be so necessary?
Yeah, so a person is definitely going to need outside support. You're not going to find it in that family system with the people who are still in it. Even if they really love you and they're good people, they can't help you because they just want to pull you back in. So you're going to have to seek outside support. That could be professionals. That could also be the support groups people will look for online. My only caveat to that is the caution of it's going to feel really good at first to commiserate with people because you just want to talk to people who've been through it and you're like, oh my God, I'm not alone. You went through it too. This is the thing that happens. But the problem is people get stuck there and then they stay in the victimhood and they don't graduate further along in the process. So you need people who have been through it, but eventually you need to be able to outgrow that and leave that behind and find people maybe who've been through it and have healed from it. They're no longer just talking about the narcissist and the psychopath. They're taking full responsibility for their life. They're doing the inner work, the very difficult, challenging work to heal themselves. And so then eventually you end up wanting to connect with people who didn't go through that and you're okay with connecting with them. You don't need that in common. So you're not looking to bond based on common traumas. You're looking to bond based on something else.
Yeah. And I, I know that there are times when you have to be a bit delicate with individuals when, I mean, what you want to say is, hey, you don't have to be a victim for the rest of your life. But that can sound invalidating, like, come on, what's wrong with you? And that's obviously not what we mean at all. So, what does it look like when you begin realizing that person is, in fact, shedding their victimization role and status and they're bringing in something new? I mean, how do we know that that's happening in a healthy kind of way?
So I wrote about it in my book, The Journey. There's a threshold there between the victim stage and the survivor stage. That threshold that a person crosses is owning 100% responsibility over their life. So when we're in the victim stage, one of the first things we need to learn is it's not your fault. Why? Because you've been blamed for everything for so long, things that weren't your fault, that it's so relieving. You need to hear it wasn't your fault. What the abuser did, what anybody else did, that's entirely on them. But your choices are your responsibility. That's the hard thing for the victim to hear because in that state of consciousness, a person hears responsibility and they interpret it as blame. So a
Yeah.
person will stay there for a while, but eventually they'll get to that point where they're ready to cross that threshold. They're going to accept that their choices are their empowerment. That's our only power is our choices. Until then, we look for false power, false security in that victim stage. But when we really start to recognize, I participated in that. I stayed in that. When I was a kid, I had no option, right? But I'm an adult now. That means I'm choosing my participation in that dynamic. Do I like the results that I'm getting? If I don't, I need to change my choices. That's the only place we're going to find our power. So when a person has that breakthrough, then they start to cross that threshold into the empowerment of the survivor stage because the empowerment is owning that responsibility.
I'm thinking of a case where let's say you have a 45-year-old woman, would you say that, and goes back home for the holidays, and it was the home was dominated by one of the parents in a very harsh and mean-spirited kind of way, and then that woman comes home from the holidays and tells her therapist, her friends, and all, it was awful, it was terrible, it was just like when I was a little kid, I got triggered all over again. And when I'm hearing that, it's like, well, at some point, you just go ahead and expect that. And when a person complains a whole lot about it, there's kind of this underlying presumption, I can't believe it's still there. But so I'm hearing you say, well, at some point, you just got to believe it and let go of any shock or let go of any expectation that it's going to be anything other than what it is. And then, like you say, and then you have to ask, nonetheless, what's my response going to be that would be different than it was years ago?
Yeah, because I think everybody has the desire to fix it. Like when you wake up and you want to fix it, you want to wake the person up. You think if I just show them the ways that they're hurting me and I communicate that, which is often what people learn in therapy, they're like, we'll be able to talk it out. We'll be able to fix it. And so it's like this repetition compulsion. And at a certain point, you have to recognize the insanity of your own choices. I had to face myself in that moment and realize I kept going back to this person expecting love and connection in a place I'm never going to get it. That's on me now. That's hard to accept.
Part of the brainwashing, which continues as long as you're with them, is when you go back and say, hey, I've changed or something's different now, that overwhelming narcissistic authoritarian person is going to more or less go back to the shame. Look at how you're making my life miserable. And they become the victim. And then they make you the perpetrator. And then the person who's trying to heal can start picking back up on that guilt all over again. And so I mean, it's like you have to anticipate those kind of things. The way I put it is you have to build in a certain amount of pessimism. And that's can be hard because it's your way of more or less saying pretty point blank, I no longer am playing the role that you used to assign me.
It's tough to do. It may be more realism, right? Than pessimism, but the realism of like this is
Okay, I
reality,
appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah,
right?
but realism about an ugly truth.
Yes, an ugly
Yeah.
truth. Yes.
Yeah. This is not easy, and bless your heart that for being willing to take on these cases. On one hand, it can be difficult. On the other hand, speaking as a therapist, it can be incredibly rewarding when you help somebody, kind of find their freedom. And freedom can be kind of its own interesting word because some folks think, well, I want freedom, but then once they have it, it's like, now what am I going to do with it? And
Right.
what I'm hearing you say is, well, this should be a pretty interesting process. What do you want to do with it?
Right. And that's the thing too, is when a person has been brainwashed in those systems, like your ability to imagine, to dream, to create gets really stifled because you get stuck in that freeze state. And so part of that healing process is getting back in touch with your creativity, start to dreaming again, start imagining how your life could be different instead of that same life that you've always known, the same patterns.
Meredith, before we wrap, do you have any kind of illustrations of people who were brainwashed? And it's like, I've got to be this way. And then over here, it's like, I'm going to go a whole different pattern. For example, I knew a guy that his whole family system insisted you have to be a medical doctor. And so we went through all of it. He hated it. And then on the other side, in his late 30s, early 40s, he went into an entirely different profession that had absolutely nothing to do with medicine. It was more working with his hands. And it's like, I just felt so liberated and it felt weird, but at the same time, it felt like it was me and I was finally discovering someone. I mean, do you have some of those kind of stories or illustrations too?
There's so many of those stories. Like what you said about like the profession, that's a big one where like the family system will like force a person into certain areas of perception. Usually in between, the person is like sleeping in a car, couch surfing, homeless. Like there's often a very, very difficult period of time in which they're fighting for their life, and they just know that's not me. I can't live like that anymore. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to get on their feet again, to go after their purpose, to live the life that they feel like their soul was born to live, and not the one that was forced on them.
Okay. Now, tell us how you can, you have your own website. What is it now?
Innerintegration.com.
Okay, and so if anybody is interested in some of the work that you do, they can get a hold of you through that, and you have your books.
Yeah.
And what are your books titles?
I have books and courses. The books are Quick Start Guide to Narcissistic Abuse Recovery. That's for very beginners who are just starting to discover what's going on. It's very short. It's the first three steps that help a person start to move forward. Then I have The Journey. That's for people who are a little farther along and they want to look at sort of the whole map of that healing journey that's going to happen. And it's written along with Joseph Campbell's Rite of Passage. So I've renamed his Rite of Passage along the stages that go with the narcissistic abuse recovery. And then I have courses for people too, digital courses that they can do to help them recover after narcissistic abuse.
We each have our specialty. We're all on the same team here, and I'm so thankful for people like you who are helping those who have their own unique set of circumstances they're having to get away from, and it really is pretty rewarding when you get to be a part of that, isn't it?
It
For
is.
you personally, and then obviously for them too. So. Meredith Miller, thank you so much for sharing about what you do and what you are looking for. And I hope it gives some good inspiration to people who are in need of what you're talking about.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Okay, and thanks, Team Healthy. You've got the ability to find information for Meredith Miller. Do so. And Meredith, once again, thanks for being with us.